Hello and welcome to the first session of German Idealism with Ben Woodard and and Pete Wolfendale. Sorry. Thank you for being here. I hope we can get the rest of. We have 3 students. Hopefully you'll be here soon. If not, hope you're watching this session now. I think Ben's going to do the introduction, so I'll pass it on to Ben for introducing the class.
All right. Thanks, Tony, and thanks to everyone for being here. So I'm just going to do a general introduction to sort of outline of German idealism, and sort of talk about why focus on systematicity or focus on systems, especially since the kind of idea of systematic philosophy or that aspect of German idealism is often seen as a kind of boogeyman, I think, in a lot of ways. And so we want to try and talk about why that shouldn't be the case. So just as a kind of background, and to talk about kind of outline of German idealism generally, is that it's all the time discussed as this sort of second coming of the philosophical excitement in the ancient world, right? This idea that it was kind of the second explosion. There was so many great thinkers all at once, it seemed impossible, especially in a place like Germany that at the time, in the late 1700s, hardly would constitute the definition of a country, let alone having its own philosophical tradition. So one of the general starting points, kind of points of interest for German idealism, is what's called the pantheism controversy. And this idea that a philosopher named Lessing in his dying days confessed that he was a Spinozist through and through, and that Spinoza was the only true philosophy. This, of course, was not okay to say out loud at the time, and so 2 of his friends and interpreters, Jacobi and Mendelssohn, both, latched onto this and tried to lay claim to Lessing's legacy and to what this meant for German philosophy and for philosophy in general. And the general claim being that Jacobi wanted to claim that reason had to give in to faith, and Mendelssohn said, no, that's nonsense. Let's not undo the Enlightenment. And so this kind of battle waged between them, and this is in 1780. And so kind of very much a part of this battle and this difficulty going on, you have in 1781, you have the Kant's Critique of Pure Reason come out, which very much undoes and sort of resets the stage for philosophy in Germany and for philosophy in general in Europe. So, following, of course, as people know, following the first critique, Kant rewrites it, does a second edition in 1786, and then in 1790, the Critique of Judgment comes out, which we'll be talking about today. And the Critique of Judgment is the one that a lot of those who would become the German idealists latch on to, because it's being the sort of the last word on Kantian philosophy. Was generally seen as this kind of great attempt and wonderful culmination of Kant's project on the one hand, but left too many unanswered questions for a lot of others at the same time. So the context, beyond this sort of important context for the course and for German idealism at the time, is that a year before the Critique of Judgment coming out, you have the French Revolution occurring. So you have not only So while you have this kind of political revolution going on in Europe, you have Germany, who's had this long history of, being this kind of Leibnizian philosophy interpreted by Wolff. This kind of very much dogmatic kind of metaphysics suddenly explodes into something different at the same time. And a part of this panic, you have many people interpreting and fighting over whether Kant is against faith or for faith, or about culminating the combination of faith and reason, or what's happening. And so you have the kind of German idealist figures we're talking about, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Fichte is being a bit older. He immediately latched on to the Kantian philosophy and interpreted it and kind of threw himself into it around 1790. And actually, the first text he wrote, people thought Kant wrote it, and it was so people found it so spectacular. So, in this kind of political and religious and philosophical upheaval, the other contributing factor, besides Fichte's engagement with Kant, is this panic where a lot of people throw their children into very traditional religious education. Like, we need to stop this craziness spreading into Germany. So, of course, this had the opposite effect, as in films when they put all the criminals together in the same cell and don't expect them to hatch a plan. You have the same effect in Tübingen, where Schelling shows up in 1791 and he gets Holderlin and Hegel as his roommates. And so from that meeting and their reading of Kant, their understanding of the French Revolution, they start to hatch all these schemes about political philosophy, philosophy in general. They cause lots of trouble. Schelling translates their French Revolutionary anthem into German and passes it around to his friends. All these things occur. Hegel leaves, and then just as Schelling is about to leave the school in 1795, he writes a letter to Hegel, in which is a very famous line where he says, Kant has given the results, but the premises are still missing. So German idealism can be seen as this attempt to try to figure out what are the premises, what is it that, what is philosophy after Kant, what can it do, what can it be? So the kind of general, philosophical things to latch onto is that the German idealists and the idealist project, they accept Kant's reboot of philosophy, saying that yes, this is a fundamentally different kind of philosophy now than what has happened. They accept the general push of Kant's project that an essential part of doing philosophy now is that reason and recognizing its own limits can actually be more productive than not recognizing its own limits. That kind of general Kantian assertion they accept, but then after that things change quite a bit. They generally accept and even could say go beyond Kant in minimizing one's ontological commitments. And this is generally seen in the German idealist view of things in themselves, or even what you want to talk about is exterior world. They want to be even more cautious generally about what your ontological claims want to be. And then following this, they think you can have systematic philosophy, you can do philosophy in a kind of systematic way, but because one needs to recognize the constraints of reason, because one should minimize the ontological commitments, it's best to start from a single founding principle. This is the general, and this isn't something that the German idealists will share, but of course what they think that is very different from one another. And so, that's sort of very broad strokes. And I think one thing and Pete and I talked about this. One thing that we want to emphasize in talking about systematicity, uh, I think for me partially stems from the fact that German idealism, as it's generally talked about in a lot of continental circles, whether it's you know often seen as something that's the property of Zizek or Adrian Johnston in a lot of ways, as it's this emphasis on subjectivity and this emphasis on the subject as being, a substantive part of the world in such a way that is, at times almost ontological, or at times almost kind of pushes the emphasis on subjectivity too far. I would say. And so the idea of focusing on systematicity on the one hand, I think, wants to check this, check the kind of over substantialization of the subject without denying how important it was, of course, for German idealism to emphasize how implicit we are in how we view the world and construct the world and interact with it. That doesn't, what that means for the sort of substance of the subject is, not necessarily the way Zizek and Johnston in that vein goes. On the other side, what I think is important to emphasize, and I know I've had discussions with Pete about this in other contexts, and it comes up in his book, that with so much emphasis on ontology and contemporary philosophy, that at the one hand you have all this kind of metaphysical claims and almost dogmatic philosophical claims occurring and happening in the name of ontology, and it's this kind of bringing in metaphysics through the back door of ontology. And it's quite odd that these kinds of moves are happening, whether it's various claims to materialism or realism, while at the same time the same people are decrying epistemology, decrying any claim to systematicity as a kind of outmoded or old-fashioned form of doing philosophy, claiming it's fascistic or anthropocentric or something.
God forbid that anyone force us to have like methodological commitments or anything like that.
Exactly right. So, the kind of last thing I'll say is that what I think is really important in German idealism, in terms of the system and in terms of the subject, it's about being very careful and systematic in how you construct, in how you talk about construction and access and these kinds of very basic issues that don't necessarily need to substantialize or overemphasize the subject, but it's just about actually, in order to do philosophy as philosophy, in order to make systematic and broad claims, which is what philosophy does, one has to be very careful and very attentive to how thought actually constructs in the world. So with that, I will... Oh, and then Pete ran off.
I just realised I had a water next to me.
So you're saying that the benefit of German idealism basically is that it gives us a system to approach thinking.
Yeah, it's in sort of, kind of taking up Kant and sort of pushing it, and sort of making potentially broader world, potentially broader claims. It's basically doing, far-reaching philosophy with Kant in mind. That's essentially what German idealism does. And so, it's very much, I don't think it's at all they advocate closed systems. The kinds of systems the different thinkers advocate, people argue about what that is, and Pete and I probably don't agree, at least in terms of Hegel and Schelling, how that plays out. But to me, it's like if you're going to do philosophy in following philosophy's general kind of ambit, that it is to be broad-reaching. If you throw out the kinds of clarifications and extensions of Kant that the German idealists did, but then claim to be doing an ontology, you're actually more likely to fall into pre-Kantian territory. And so, again, it's a self-conscious move about how philosophies are done. The German idealists really, I think, importantly clarified. So hopefully the course will lay that out.
Yeah.
So, Pete.
Okay, well, I'm going to set myself a bit of a timer. I'm probably going to go beyond it, but we'll see how it goes. I'm basically in agreement with everything that Ben says. Crucially, I mean, the way I see German idealism as a kind of rough movement is this kind of incredible combination of philosophical ambition with methodological scruples. And that kind of insistence on methodology, on being kind of as critical as possible in this very kind of precise sense, begins with, as Matthew was asking, it begins with thought. And this is Kant's real innovation, is to kind of to turn philosophy back on its own modes of thinking in order to try and establish foundations from which to then move out. And I'll say some more specific things about that shortly. I'll also say something more specific about this relationship between the subject and substance, which is quite different to this Zizek'ian line. But I want to kind of start by clearing the air of a few cliches. Because I don't know how many people have ever been taught anything about Kant before, but there's a few kind of Kantian cliches that people learn and then think they know about Kant, and then they can move on. So the ones I have in mind are this idea of the Copernican revolution. So Kant described himself as saying, well, rather than thinking about our the conforming of our thought to objects, why don't we turn around and think about the conforming of the objects to our thought? And this is obviously there. This is an actual important part of Kant. But if you merely stop there, you end up with you end up essentially focusing on the other main cliches, which are, well, Kant thinks that space and time and the categories and other things are inside us and don't apply to things in themselves, and so you get focused on this distinction between phenomena and noumena, between objects as they appear to us and things in themselves, and you end up missing all of the important stuff that Kant developed on the back of this twist. You essentially end up not understanding the point of the Copernican turn in the first place. So one misunderstanding that tends to come out of this, for instance, is a lot of people think that Kant ends metaphysics, that Kant prevents metaphysics from ever happening again or from doing metaphysics. Whereas actually Kant has a positive metaphysical project. It's just not what he's doing in the first critique, for instance. The critical philosophy, the critique of metaphysics, is the limitation, right? And then he'll go on in a book called The Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science to actually do positive metaphysics within the system of constraints that he's established. So that's an important kind of understanding to get rid of. Similarly, the other kind of cliche which parallels this is in the practical philosophy. The only thing that people learn about Kant is the categorical imperative. And it usually gets taught as some kind of, or like at worst, it gets taught as some version of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This can then be easily dismissed with the kind of the standard criticism, which comes from Hegel, actually, that really all this is an empty form, and you can't get any substance out of it. And that criticism may or may not be true, but the actual thing that's being criticized is at least for Kant, thought that there was more there than an empty form. Kant thought that from the very structure of practical reason itself, he could determine constraints upon and then actually do substantive practical philosophy. So one of the last things he published was the metaphysics of morals. So most people know Kant's practical philosophy through the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, which is written way, way earlier. When he actually gets to the final metaphysics of morals, he's talking about this very complex and rich system of practical prescriptions that includes things that look quite familiar, like virtue ethicists. He's talking about virtues and institutions and things like this. So it's worthwhile emphasizing that Kant has, even if he's wrong, he has positive things he wants to do in the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals that go beyond his critical philosophy. So this is one reason why I figured setting the introduction to the third critique, why I thought setting that was a good idea, because I think, well, for one, this is the only place where Kant really gives a kind of retrospective architectonic of his philosophical system. At the very least, the critical part of it. He never actually intended to write either the second or the third critiques. But nevertheless, when he has written these, he can explain why and how they fit together. And the explanation he gives, as you'll know if you've done the reading, is precisely in terms of this split between what he calls doctrinal philosophy, right? The actual systematic cognition of objects through concepts, right? Which he divides between the theoretical and the practical domains. So the philosophy of nature on the one hand and practical philosophy on the other, right? And critical philosophy, which he explicitly identifies as a critique of cognition. So in order for us to understand and work properly through these theoretical and practical domains, which he very much understands as domains of judgments. Right? These are spheres of kinds of judgments about certain kinds of objects. Right? We need to understand what judging is and what it is for us to have judgments about these specific kinds of objects, and to delimit what can legitimately be said within these domains and what is, the mere overextension of reason. So, however, this contrast between the doctrinal and the critical sides of philosophy is made particularly sharp by the third critique, because precisely what he identifies in the introduction is the fact that there is this realm of technique. So rather than judgments about the way the world is, or judgments about the way the world should be, judgments about how we judgments about the means through which we realize the way in which the world should be, or realize any desire that we happen to have, the means to the ends. And this is anything to do with skill or art. And what he kind of identifies is that these sorts of claims or judgments don't have a domain of their own. They don't have their own kind of object. Really, they're just a subset of the theoretical domain. They're effectively just claims about the way in which the world is, and how, on the basis of that, how it can be exploited, right, to our ends. But technique, nevertheless, does have a distinct part in the critique of cognition, even if it doesn't have a distinct part of the doctrinal philosophy. And this is why we have a critique of judgment. So, I mean, just to give you the systematic picture, which is just there in the introduction, you know, he identifies basically three higher faculties of cognition. So there's cognition proper, which is the object of the first critique, and in cognition proper, it's the faculty of the understanding. So there's a distinction between higher and lower faculties here. And it's the faculty of the understanding that is in charge, that is legislating, because essentially what we are concerned with in cognition proper is cognizing the lawfulness of nature. But in the other two higher faculties, which are the objects of the second and the third critique, what we have is a kind of a modification of cognition, in which in the second critique we're interested in desire, which is what happens when cognition becomes legislated for by reason. And Kant has a really sort of interesting definition of the faculty of desire, which is the faculty for realizing the objects of your representation. It basically just means the faculty for bringing about the way you think the world should be. You can represent the world as being a certain way, or you can represent the world as being the way you want it to be, and then desire is acting so as to produce the way you want it to be. But the third critique is concerned with the higher faculty of pleasure and pain. And well, crucially, in its higher exercise, this is legislated for by judgment, and it's going to be responsible for everything that anyone might be familiar with from Kant's aesthetics. The judgments of the beautiful, or the experience of the beautiful and the experience of the sublime. But actually understanding why judgment is responsible for this higher faculty of pleasure and pain, and how it is that judgment is mediating between reason and understanding, and thus between the critiques of the faculty of cognition proper and the faculty of desire, is a bit more complicated. And in fact, to understand it properly, we've got to start talking about these lower faculties. But I'm going to kind of push that a bit down the road, because I want, well, really, in order to do any of this, we actually have to talk substantially about the first critique. So, how am I doing for time? Okay, right. So, in talking about the first critique, I want to start by mentioning a couple important historical precursors. So Kant, as Ben mentioned, did kind of reinvent philosophy in many ways, but he wasn't working from nothing. So the sort of crucial precursors are the scholastic philosophy and the two wings of modern philosophy, empiricism and rationalism, that had kind of grown up in response to it. Kant is quite familiar with both of these and is drawing on resources from both of them. Thirdly, he's also incredibly inspired by Newton. It's really hard to underestimate the significance of Newtonian physics for Kant, insofar as it, well, not just for Kant, but for a lot of people, it represented this kind of sea change in natural philosophy, like the actual establishment of a proper science, to the extent that other sciences such as biology and chemistry were ultimately judged by the success of Newtonian physics. Right. There's sort of two important things to take away from scholasticism. One is scholasticism's conception of metaphysics. Right? This is very much this informs Kant's critique importantly. There's two important ideas of aspects of this. One is the interpretation of metaphysics as metaphysics, as beyond physics. This is an accident of classification, which then became interpreted as a substantial part of the meaning of the term. But it essentially, post-Aristotle and through scholasticism, metaphysics becomes associated with the idea of thinking about that which is beyond experience. And Kant will be playing with that. The other important notions that come out of scholastic metaphysics is this distinction, well, is the distinction between what they call metaphysica generalis, which is also called ontology. This is the original use of the word ontology, and metaphysica specialis. So this is roughly cosmology, psychology, and theology. So metaphysica generalis was supposed to be concerned with the being of beings in general. Right? What can be said about beings insofar as they are beings, right? Whereas metaphysica specialis was concerned with specific domains of beings, specific domains of objects that can be talked about. And crucially, theology was the foundational one here. In the first critique, the split between the transcendental aesthetic and transcendental analytic and the transcendental dialectic is essentially corresponds to this distinction between metaphysica generalis and metaphysica specialis. What Kant's doing in the transcendental analytic is basically what he thinks of as ontology. So we'll talk about this when we come to the categories, but and his critique of scholastic metaphysics will be found in the transcendental dialectic, where he'll basically be trying to show how the objects that it thinks it's talking about, which are beyond experience, are therefore illegitimate, precisely because they are beyond experience. The second precursor I wanted to talk about, the second thing I was talking about with regard to scholasticism was syllogistic logic. I don't know how familiar anybody is with logic, but if you've learned any modern logic, and anyone then goes and shows you Aristotelian syllogisms, they will look very alien and very strange. And this causes problems when we go back and we read philosophy before Frege. And this is especially the case in German idealism after Kant, where they are really heavily invested in logic that isn't exactly Aristotelian. It has some slight differences, but is fundamentally informed by the scholastic tradition of syllogistic, of Aristotelian syllogistic. Just to say something briefly about this, there are kind of three parts of Aristotelian logic. What you have is a doctrine of terms, a doctrine of judgments, and a doctrine of inferences. So your terms are the things you combine to get judgments, and you combine them in ways like you say, all men are mortal, right? Men and mortality are the kind of two predicates you've got there. Well, one of them being a subject and one of them being a predicate, but the subject can become a predicate of a different judgment. Such as when you say, Socrates is a man, right? So Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. Therefore, we can infer from those two premises, the major and the minor premise, our conclusion: Socrates is mortal, right? This is the way in which all logic was done before Kant. Kant introduces some innovations, but the important thing is that this split of doctrine of terms, doctrine of judgments, and doctrine of inferences corresponds to the faculties of thinking that he's basing his architectonic around. So the understanding will correspond to the doctrine of terms insofar as it's about concepts. It's about the concepts that are combined in creating judgments. The faculty of judgment is the doctrine of judgments, right? And the faculty of reason is fundamentally concerned with syllogism, with inference. And this, again, if you read through, starts to make sense of how Kant thinks that judgment mediates between understanding and reason. And that's why the third critique is mediating between the first and the second. We can see a bit more of that when I get to the faculties. But it's important to bear this structure in mind. Right. Very quickly, rationalism and empiricism. So a crucial influence on Kant was Hume and Hume's metaphysical skepticism. So Hume really kind of took this scholastic definition of metaphysics as that which is beyond experience and used it to claim that metaphysics was impossible. So he has this kind of epistemological critique of metaphysics, which is based on the idea that essentially all knowledge comes from experience. Kant takes this incredibly seriously. In fact, it's legitimate to interpret his project as trying to limit, well, okay, so if all knowledge does come from experience, what else can be said? What is, if we can't transcend experience, what can we nevertheless find, well, on the boundary between experience and that which lies beyond it? The claims which provide or express the conditions of the possibility of experience. This is the synthetic a priori and all it contains. The two other important ideas that come out of empiricism and rationalism are, well, one is the contrast between the two. So, as I've sort of indicated, empiricism was obsessed with knowledge from experience. But this means that its model of thought was very much based on sensation. So in Locke, there really isn't a distinction between thinking and sensation. There's just ideas. Right? Ideas come from experience. And then when we think on our own, there's ideas again. In Hume, you get a distinction between impressions and ideas. But even then, ideas are understood in terms of impressions. They're derivative. Whereas The opposite is the case in, say, Descartes or Leibniz, where concepts rather than ideas are understood as primary. Thinking and reflection and the intellect is understood as principal, and then experience tends to get understood as derivative, as like a lesser form of thought, a weaker form of reflection. Kant fundamentally wants to synthesize these two, and wants to acknowledge that both sensation and intellect have a role to play in the constitution of thought. But the way in which he does this, calling back to this what I just said about syllogistic, is to recognize what's wrong in both empiricism and rationalism. So both empiricism and rationalism fundamentally start from what I just called the doctrine of terms. So they're interested in like ideas or concepts, but these are the terms that get combined to create judgment. And you understand these first, right, on their own. So we just think about how it is that we understand objects. Sorry, doctrine of terms. So, for instance, we understand the meaningfulness or the content of an idea in empiricism in terms of this kind of direct relation between the idea and experience or sense impression. So, like, we just have an immediate understanding of redness because we've got this sensation of redness, right? Kant is very, very interesting in the history of philosophy for being basically the first person to express the primacy of the propositional. Right? The doctrine of judgments becomes primary, and we understand the terms in terms of their contribution to judgment. So concepts become functions of judgment, to use Kant's own phrase. And I'll explain this a bit more later, hopefully. Right. Third and final precursor. Yeah, I'm taking way too much time. But the third and final precursor is Descartes, and Descartes' notion of the subject. And this is, well, this is directly relevant to what Ben was saying, insofar as what you can see in Descartes is this conception of thought as a relation between subject and object, right? But in order to think the subject, he has to think the subject as a substance. And he has to think the subject's representations of the object as special kinds of properties that special kind of substance has. So this is the root of Descartes' dualism, right? In order to explain thought, he has to posit two fundamentally different kinds of thing, thought and extension, right? What is perhaps most radical about Kant is the way in which he reconceives this relationship between subject and object and what the subject is in this context, right? So rather than thinking of the subject as a substance, Kant fundamentally thinks of the subject as a status, right? What I mean by that is a certain kind of normative status. And to explain this somewhat more clearly, what Kant is interested in is what it is to be responsible for a judgment about an object, right? What is it to be responsible for the correctness of one's representations of an object, right? To be responsible in that way, to be able to be responsible in that way, is to count as a subject, right? And that's not specified in any kind of metaphysical terms. It's just a purely normative notion, right? And it's from this kind of desubstantialization of the subject, really, that the whole of the rest of Kant's critical edifice will be constructed. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's this concept of synthetic a priori judgments. So the way in which Kant himself will introduce what he's doing is this question: how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? I haven't talked about the analytic-synthetic distinction or the a priori a posteriori distinction, and so I don't want to introduce Kant this way, despite the fact it's the way he introduces himself. I think a better way to introduce what Kant is doing is through the notion of transcendental psychology. Right? Okay, so Kant distinguishes this idea of transcendental psychology from empirical psychology. So he very much thought Hume and the British empiricists and people coming after them were doing this kind of loosely empirical psychological study of how our minds actually function. What he's interested in is not how our minds actually function, but how they must function if we are to be subjects in this way. So he's interested in conditions of the possibility of being a subject. Or to put the question in a better way, what does something need to be able to do in order to count as making a judgment? So this primacy of the judgment is the very foundation of the project. We start with this very minimal notion of judgment and we work backwards into, well, how is it possible for something to count as making judgments, right? How can something have the status of being a subject that can represent things correctly or incorrectly? Now, this way of going around about things, it's interesting to mention that Kant was very clear that in pursuing transcendental psychology, he was not interested in humans as such. He was interested in rational beings of any kind. You know, he explicitly was thinking about aliens. Right? He was talking about Kant's interest in Newton. Kant actually originated one of the sort of first comprehensive theories of the formation of planets and solar systems and galaxies and galactic clusters. So he was, when he was thinking about aliens, he was genuinely thinking, we are not the center of the universe. There's got to be other beings on other planets. He was also thinking about angels and God, but I tend to downplay that a bit more. Particularly because when he talks about God, he thinks of God as an infinite being that actually creates things by intuiting them. And he contrasts us as finite beings that require intuition. So leave God to one side. But another term that Kant himself wouldn't have used, which I use in trying to articulate this stuff, is artificial intelligence, or rather artificial general intelligence. Right? What Kant, in being interested in, what does something have to be able to do in order to make a judgment, is just interested in, essentially, how can you construct something, a creature, a being, in order that it has this status? And that's just the project of artificial intelligence, an abstract diagram of rational agency. Thinking of it in these terms, you end up painting transcendental psychology as a kind of functionalism, which is to say, what we're going to do is describe the parts of this diagram in terms of their roles within a certain system that can do at overall judgment. So this gives you a slightly different way of looking at Kantian psychology. So when Kant talks about representations, you can just read information. When he talks about synthesis, you can just read information processing, right? And when he talks about faculties, really you can just think about functional subsystems in information processing. And crucially, thinking about it in these terms means you don't have to think of these faculties as being modular, right? It's not like for Kant to be right, in our brains we have to have these separate things: reason, understanding, judgment, sense. They don't have to be distinct modules any more than, say, the circulatory system, the limbic system, and the respiratory system in mammals are separate. They're functionally distinct. They don't need to be causally distinct. We're just interested in the abstract functional subsystems that are required in order to constitute something that can make a judgment. Now, Kant himself wouldn't describe this in functional terms, but this is very interesting because Kant does actually have a theory of functional explanation, or teleological judgment. And that's the other part of the third critique, and maybe we'll get to discuss that, but I'm going to leave that to one side because it is a crucial whole. Kant never connects transcendental psychology to this. Right. I recognise that I'm going on for quite a long time here, so what I'm going to try and do is I shared a PDF on the Google Classroom and also in the chat. I might have to reshare it. There you are. I'm also going to screen share it for complete overkill. And this is my kind of condensed table of what's going on in Kant's transcendental psychology, or his theory of the faculties. What you'll see here is just everything that goes into the faculty of cognition proper. We're not really talking about the other higher faculties here, though we're talking about the things that will go into them. Oh crap, have I not given people permission? How do I just let everyone out? Never mind. If you can just read the what's being screen shared, we should be okay. Right. So what we've got here is the principal distinction between sensibility and intellect. Right. These are the two things we associated with empiricism and rationalism, but which Kant separates out. And crucially, this separation then creates the problem of how these two things are related. Can everybody see this, by the way, just to make sure it's all... Is everybody all right?
Yes.
Great, okay. So there's a crucial problem once you've separated these two things, how they relate. But we'll talk about the particular parts of them for now. Just so on the side of the intellect, we've already briefly talked about understanding, judgment, and reason. Right? These roughly correspond to the doctrine of terms, doctrine of judgment, and doctrine of syllogisms, or concepts, propositions, and inferences. Right? The other crucial way in which Kant describes this as, so understanding is the faculty of grasping the general. Judgment is about the subsumption of the particular under the general, and reason is about the determination of the particular through the general. So, to give you an example, it's the difference between understanding the concept of dog, right? Actually being able to subsume a particular dog or a particular animal under that concept, right? Which is something that is done non-inferentially, right? And then the determination of a particular through the general concept. So for instance, once you know, right, Fido is a dog, right, you can then determine through syllogism that because all dogs are mammals or all dogs are carnivores, right, Fido is therefore a carnivore. So you can see here why judgment sits in between understanding and reason. Because without this ability to subsume, without this ability to actually apply concepts to things, you don't have any premises for your syllogism. Right. On the other hand, the two halves of sensibility are sense and imagination. And sense itself splits into inner and outer sense. Inner sense just being kind of internal awareness of your own mental processes, the stream of consciousness, and outer sense being any external awareness. Now, crucially, Kant doesn't talk about different modalities of sensation, like sense, taste, like smell, taste, sight, anything like this. He just kind of combines them all together. But from the perspective of transcendental psychology, this is quite good, because we're not interested in the particular kinds of sensory modalities that something has. We're just interested in this general ability to sense stuff outside of it. The imagination then is split into the reproductive and the productive imagination. The best way to understand this is, so I've explained here what the role of the two sides of the imaginations are, listed some, but the one to really focus on is simulation. So what the imagination enables us to do is to actually simulate the world, right? And crucially, if any of you are interested in sort of cognitive psychology or the work of Thomas Metzinger, if you've ever come across any of this stuff, this is quite like the global workspace theory of consciousness, in which the idea is that actually our experience of the world is already a simulation. It's not like we only simulate when we're dreaming, for instance. Right? A dream could be seen as a sort of simulation of a world, right? But that actually our experience here and now is a kind of online simulation, right? What we have is this sort of spatiotemporal framework that we set up, in which we populate with stuff on the basis of sensory input. So for Kant, this sort of synthesis of experience is this population of the imagination, right? With, well, I'll explain the specific terms, but loosely, with objects that are being constituted out of sensory information that's being brought in. Okay. Yeah. Okay, next part of the diagram. Well, crucially, the kinds of representation or the kinds of information that are being dealt with by the different faculties are different, right? So sensibility is concerned with intuitions, the understanding is concerned with concepts, judgment is concerned with judgments, reason is concerned with inferences, right, as we said. But there's a crucial distinction between the a priori structures here and the a posteriori ones. That's actually a bad way of putting it, because the distinction kind of cuts across. We have tried to put it in the diagram as in terms of form and content. So this is clearest when we talk about sense, right, where the forms of inner and outer sense are time and space. These are like the information formats, right? The global format in terms of which, like, sensory information has to be structured. Right? Thinking of this in terms of the reproductive imagination, right? Our simulation of this world we're in, be it a dream or be it our current experience, right, is spatio-temporal. It's structured by these forms, but these forms are themselves, for Kant, intuitions. They're not concepts. And what is then fit into these forms are what he calls appearances. So like discrete kinds of sense data, like specific sounds or shapes or regions of color get formatted and fit into this spatio-temporal simulation. What the reproductive imagination does is to take these appearances and to synthesize them, which is to say combine them into what Kant will call images. So if the appearances are these discrete pieces of data, right, the images are actually spatio-temporal continuity. So the examples I've given here are like a dog running past me, right, in my experience. Right? That's a continuity, the whole experience. It's not merely the dog then or now or like one part of it. The particular part, the front of it that I see as it comes at me and the rear that it goes. It's all these things put together into a continuity of experience. Similarly, the other example I give is a house with an unseen interior. Right? The house is an image constituted within the simulation that nevertheless has bits that aren't filled in. Right? There are bits that I can't simulate, but I can simulate their absence. Right? Okay. It's the point where we start getting to the productive imagination here, and what you'll see at the bottom in terms of content, schematism, that everything gets a bit weird. And in order to explain that properly, it's important to kind of move back a little bit. So I've said that there's this problem of connecting sensibility and intellect. So Kant famously says that intuitions without concepts are empty, and concepts without intuitions are blind. You need both of them. How do you put them together? I think this emptiness and this blindness are actually best demonstrated by sort of a couple of kind of trivial examples. So in terms of, sorry, my cat's squeaking. In terms of blindness, it's useful to think about, well, literal blindness, right? Take a blind biologist, right? It's entirely possible to be a biologist and be blind, right? Like if someone brings an animal into the room, you can't tell what it is, right? You have no way of synthesizing that kind of sensory data. But nevertheless, we would like to say that a blind biologist can understand the concept of a dog or a tiger or a protozoan, right? They can grasp these concepts, even if they lack the ability to apply those concepts on the basis of intuition. So there's some sense in which we can see there's conceptual understanding, right? The best way to think about this is in terms of inference, actually, which is to say a blind biologist will still be able to infer that, well, if that's a dog, then it's an animal. If that's a dog, then it's a carnivore, right? They will have these forms of inferential competence that mean they possess the concept, even if they can't subsume things under it non-inferentially, right? The question of how sensibility and intellect are connected is precisely this question of how that subsumption takes place, right? What's the difference between the blind biologist and the biologist who can apply the concept on the basis of experiential data? This isn't the way Kant would describe it, but I think it's the best way of going at it. Now, crucially, for Kant, what mediates between concept and intuition is what he calls the schema, or in plural, schemata. I'm never sure if I should pluralize that properly or not, but here we go. And why it connects the two is because, like the concept, It's a rule. Concepts are fundamentally rules for, well, for inference, as I was saying. It's a rule like the concept, it's an operation, right? So it's connected to the understanding. But what it is a rule for is not a rule for inference, but a rule for synthesis. A rule for synthesizing within the imagination images out of appearances, right? So this means that there is an empirical schema of dog, right? There is a rule for taking all this jumbled sense data that I get when I see a dog running past me, right, and synthesizing it into an image. And like this may seem a little bit ad hoc, but the crucial thing to understand is that what's going on in the reproductive imagination is not just retention, but also projection. These are terms from Husserl, if anyone's familiar with Husserl. So it's not just that, like for instance, when I hear a tune, right, I'm not just hearing the immediate note that's present now, I'm hearing all of the notes that have led up to this in order to experience the tune as tune, right? Same with a dog, right? I'm retaining all of this sensory data in the imagination as a kind of continuity. But it's not even just that it stops at the present. I also have this kind of expectation or projection of what's going on in the future. I have an expectation of how to continue to synthesize this spatio-temporal dynamic as it continues to unfold, right? And you'll know from experience that sometimes things do not unfold the way in which you expect, and it takes a while for you to readjust to the way in which you think the contents of space and time should be. So when you've applied a schemata to appearances to create this image, you will get this kind of continuous development of your experience in a neat way. And crucially, the idea is that there's a connection between this schema of dog and the concept of dog, the kind of logical unity, right, in the concept, and the kind of unity of synthesis in the schema, right? So in the first critique, Kant will describe what he calls the three syntheses what is it? What are they all? He just calls them the three syntheses: apprehension, reproduction, and recognition. So the idea is we get data, we turn it into appearances, we format it, we reproductively synthesize it into images, and then these unities in the imagination are given logical unity by being subsumed under a concept. And crucially, a useful way of thinking about that logical unity is in terms of this idea of absence. So what I said in images is the house can be synthesized in such a way that there are bits of it that you haven't seen, but you're aware that you haven't seen them. With logical unity, this lack of features is not just sensible ones, but any kind of predicate that can be applied to it. So once you have this logical unity, the house is an object, right, as a house, right, you've got sensible questions like, well, what's its financial value? Like, how's it doing in the recent housing market crash? And there's various different things that can be said about it, which are not simply like immediately experientially accessible. So there's this relationship between unity in the imagination and the logical unity of judgment that you get in the application of concepts. Now, in the third critique, Kant describes this completely differently. He has this distinction between apprehension, comprehension, and presentation. In order to understand that, you kind of have to see a little bit more about schema, but I'll leave that for now. I think the one last thing that's worth saying is, so I haven't said anything about the productive imagination, right? So the productive imagination is what's behind schema, right? It's the thing that performs particular operations in accordance with rules given by the understanding. And this is most obvious when you're talking about pure rather than empirical schema. So for instance, circle, cube, right? These are things that you can construct in your imagination without any input data. They're like inbuilt data types, if you're interested in computing, right? And crucially, this is the way in which Kant thinks about mathematics, and this is what influences a whole school of mathematical philosophy called intuitionism. There's this idea that fundamentally mathematics is about construction in the imagination, and construction which is not dependent upon any kind of empirical input. We can just think about equilateral triangles. We can perform a constructive proof of Pythagoras' theorem in our imagination if we want to. Right? That's the productive imagination. So, if this is how Kant thinks you get this kind of connection between intellect and sensibility, the question is, how is this possible? Like, why? How can you guarantee that this works? This is the question of the transcendental deduction, which I'm not going to give that argument because it's too big. We could have several sessions just of interpretations of the transcendental deduction. But I'll give you the sort of cribbed version of how Kant thinks this works. So crucially, one thing I haven't said anything about properly yet is the categories. So I mentioned that Kant's begun with judgment, and what he's interested in is not judgment in the kind of abstract syntactic sense that's dealt with by formal logic, or what he calls general logic, but he's interested in judgments insofar as they have a connection to objects, like judgments that can potentially be true or false because they correctly or incorrectly represent objects. Right. This is the other side of this Cartesian development of his switch on Descartes. And crucially, this is a useful way of thinking about what I talked about in terms of the Copernican turn at the beginning. So the reason Kant says, well, what we should be interested in is the conformance of objects to us rather than us to them, why we should be thinking about the synthesis of objective experience, right, is that he doesn't want to explain the way in which judgment works, or this representational relation between subject and object, by appealing to pre-constituted objects, because that would mean appealing to the concept of representation in advance. Right, it would mean already having some notion of reference. What he's interested in doing is giving a complete account of what he calls objective validity, which is this potential of judgments to be true or false insofar as they're related to an object that constrains whether or not what we're saying is correct or incorrect. Crucially, and I should have said this earlier, this is why the relationship between sensibility and intellect is so important, because if you again look at what I've said about the intellect in terms of doctrine of terms, doctrine of judgments, doctrine of syllogisms. What there isn't there is singularity. All you have is universality. You've got generality or particularity, but you don't have singular things that can be subsumed under concept. That's what is given by sensibility, is singularity. But this singularity isn't yet reference. It's not like sensibility just gives us pre-constituted objects that we can then subsume under concept. We're just given the things themselves. No, rather Kant's whole account is how is it that sensibility, by providing this kind of connection with singularity, constitutes objects that provide constraints upon the truth or falsity of judgment. Sorry, that was a bit of a dense little tirade. Okay. Right. How is the accord between sensibility and intellect possible? Now, this idea of objective validity enables Kant to distinguish between general and transcendental logic. So general logic is logic just as it's concerned with like the syntactic form of judgment. Transcendental logic is logic insofar as it's concerned with the relations of judgments to objects, right? Now, Kant has this account of general logic, which is to say he has an account of what he thinks all the possible forms of judgments are. He's got this table of judgments, 12 different possible kinds, right? Now, he transposes this into a table of categories, which is the transcendental logical equivalent, right? All of the ways in which we can possibly judge about objects, right? And these are the categories. They're broken down into 4 kinds: quantity, quality, relation, modality, and there's 3 under each of these, right? I won't go into them in detail, but taken together, what these are pure concepts. Like they're the concepts that apply to any object. And when you take them together, what that means is they give you the concept of an object in general, or what he calls the transcendental object. So this is the very minimal structure of objectivity, of the logical unity of the object, right? Also calls it the object equals X, right? The question is, how do you guarantee that whatever is given in experience can be subsumed under these concepts? How can you guarantee that whatever you're given in experience can be synthesized as objects that fall under the categories, right? This is the problem, as I say, of the transcendental deduction. But the basic way Kant solves it is in terms of what he calls the transcendental schematism. So his idea is that it's not, you don't just have pure schemata like circle, cube, and empirical schemata like plate or dog, these rules for synthesizing intuitions. You also have what you might want to think of as rules for rules. Right? These are the rules for rules of synthesis. Right? And the transcendental schematism is essentially the application of these rules to the forms of space and time as they constitute this space of simulation in the imagination. Like, look, there are certain fundamental basic operations, right, that are performed within the imagination on appearances. Whatever is given is formatted in such a way that it is germane to these operations, and this can be synthesized into images that can then have concepts applied. Right? So Kant thinks that sort of there is a harmony, he actually calls it affinity, established in advance by the application of the transcendental schemata to the manifold of intuition. Right. I'm nearly done here with transcendental psychology, and I should probably just skip ahead completely. But what I'd like to say briefly is, so Kant has this concept of the transcendental unity of apperception. And this is, I've put this underneath the understanding in the diagram. It's also related to what he calls the transcendental subject, right? And it's also related to the concept of self-consciousness, right? And crucially, what the transcendental subject is not a substance, right? All it is the unity of the understanding in its action on the imagination. So the activity of the understanding in constituting the imagination such that, right, we have this pre-established harmony in which things get synthesized, right? That is the transcendental subject, right? It's just what is responsible for the correct application of rules within this context, right? It's the unity of activity, but in that sense, it's also the unity of responsibility, right? Anything like an empirical subject is a particular mode of consciousness that takes place within this framework. So a way to think about this is just to say that everything that's being synthesized within my experience is being synthesized in such a way that it can be potentially formed into a judgment, right? I've got all these objects around me, right? And they are schematized, which is to say they're already kind of sort of pre-categorized. I see a table, I see a chair, I see cups, I see books, right? I haven't made any judgments of these things yet, but I can make judgments of them because they've been properly constituted, right? There's all of this information processing going on in setting things up this way, right? And as far as Kant's concerned, it is conscious, right? It is related to the empirical subject insofar as there's the possibility for it to become self-conscious. There's the possibility for it to be raised to judgment. And what makes all of these various different threads of information processing that are running in the same system, part of the same system, right, is this unitary activity which constitutes the framework within which they all work, right? That's what enables us to say, I think, and then make a judgment, and I think, and make another judgment in relation to two things that have been synthesized by separate processes, and potentially to think them both at the same time and relate them, right? The I in that statement, right, is just this unity of synthesis, this underlying responsibility for synthesizing and judging correctly. Right. Okay. I'll say two more things, and then I'll skip a whole bunch of stuff, and we'll just try and open up, and I'll let Ben tell me what I've missed. So that account of how sort of objects get synthesized in an experience and how this constitutes a sort of connection between object and judgment that makes judgments, actually count as potentially true or false, right? Has been kind of just focused directly on the understanding, on this, well, really a mix of understanding and judgment, because it's about the subsumption of the particular under the general. That doesn't say anything about reason. What you might want to, what Kant himself draws a contrast between is the unity of understanding and the unity of reason. So when I talk about this unity of apperception as just being like the activity of the understanding on sensibility in enabling us to have this kind of rich object-constituted experience in which judgment becomes possible, right? What reason does is to actually connect up the different judgments. So although the unity of the understanding provides the possibility of me thinking various different judgments together, right, various representations together and various judgments about them together, reason has the responsibility of making them consistent and systematic. So the unity of reason is really the unity of the subject as someone who has a range of commitments, a range of judgments that form a picture of the world as a whole, rather than just its immediate experience, right? And it's through being the faculty of inference that it's capable of establishing this kind of systematic unity. Because fundamentally notions like consistency and comprehensiveness and economy do with whether or not things imply contradictions or what they imply and this, that, and the other. This leads me to kind of the final bit, which is the pure or the formal side of reason here is what Kant calls the transcendental ideas. And if the concepts of the understanding have these fundamental connections to objects, what distinguishes the transcendental ideas is basically their lack of such a connection. They're like concepts that can never have a connection to an objective experience. So the three are the soul, the world, and God. And he thinks that these kind of essentially constitute rules for synthesizing, or they're sort of ideals governing the way in which we synthesize this set of judgments we've got, and try and create this kind of consistent picture of a world in which the soul has a relation to God. Anyway, I could talk about the specific ideas there. I'm going to leave it. But fundamentally, this is where the transcendental dialectic takes up. Precisely because he has this account of how judgments are related to objects in experience, he can then have a whole account of how it is that reason is able to push itself beyond such relation, and what this means about how reason can go wrong, how it can overextend itself. Right. Okay. That's a potted account of cognition in the first critique. I could say something about the second critique. I'm just not going to. I should say something about the third critique because this is where we started with. All I'm going to say is something brief, and then we can open up and we can have questions and discussion, and maybe more things will come out. What I want to say is that, so it's important, like I said at the beginning, that the third critique doesn't have a domain of its own. Right? There's the theoretical domain of judgments and its objects, and sorry, I'll stop sharing that. So there's the theoretical domain of judgments about nature and the objects of experience, right? And then there's the practical domain of judgments about freedom, right, and its objects, which are noumenal fundamentally, but I won't talk about that. We can maybe discuss this. The critique, insofar as it's concerned with aesthetic judgments, judgments about beauty or sublimity, right? These judgments don't form a domain because they don't have their own special object, right? But nevertheless, an account can be given of them because he has this account of judgment and the transcendental psychological conditions that make that judgment possible, right? So the account of judgments of beauty is also an account of the experience of the beautiful. And fundamentally, it's understood in terms of how the ordinary story about judgment and experience goes wrong, or how it gets disrupted in certain specific ways. So that I'll give you a very, very brief explanation of the beautiful and the sublime, and we'll cut it there. So what happens in the experience of the beautiful is that the synthesis of objects of experience leading to judgment, right, and recognition, like the dog running in front of me and me going, right, that's an Alsatian, right, this dog's an Alsatian, right, determinate judgment, right, concepts applied. The synthesis gets going, and it plays with rules for synthesis, right? So if you think I've got all of these stored schema for, think about, for instance, if you were on a foggy night and you see something in the distance, right, through the fog, and you're not sure is that a traffic warden? Is that two people like making out on a wall? I can't quite. And so your mind's kind of trying to find ways of processing it and recognize it, right? There's this process of synthesis in which there's a crucial element of experimentation involved. Now Kant thinks that element of sort of experimentation, trying out different ways of synthesizing experience, is involved in all judgments. He just thinks that it's there at the beginning, and then you find the rule and everything proceeds, and ultimately you get a determinate judgment and all's fine, right? What happens in the beautiful is that never stops, right? You get caught up in the experience of, could it be this, could it be that? Your mind, or the understanding and the imagination, basically keeps swapping rules and swapping possibilities and developing. And this is what he calls free play. Now, the reason that this is pleasurable and the reason that it leads to a peculiar kind of judgment is that Kant thinks that there's the a priori principle of the faculty of judgment is what he calls the technique of nature, or the idea that nature is constituted in such a way as to be easily cognizable by us, as to be cognizable by us as a kind of system. So you remember what I was saying about the job of reason is to get our judgments and our concepts and make them into a systematic picture of the world. Now, although the transcendental schematism guarantees that the world is cognizable in a sense, right? We can make judgments about it. It doesn't guarantee that this will be easy. That in fact, the systematic task of reason will be even possible, right? The nature must be law-like, constituted in a law-like way, but these laws could be, so complicated and strange and bizarre as to be entirely beyond it, right? Kant thinks that in order for us to think about the world, we have to kind of presume as a regulative principle that nature is constructed in such a way as to be cognizable by us. I think one of the ways he puts this is that nature is rich in its species but sparing in its genera, right? So that there will be like a hierarchy of genus and species that we can neatly find. We can get this wonderful economy of concepts and principles, right? What happens in the experience of the beautiful is, in recognizing that we've entered this state of free play, we find that actually, wait a minute, nature is constituted in such a way that we can think through it. In fact, it's, our faculties are so appropriate to it that they can run away with all of these range of associations. And it's at that point that you have the judgment of the beautiful. You have this, wow, this is beautiful. But in such a way that you're not actually subsuming the this under a determinate concept. To say it's beautiful is not to say that it is determinately any way in an objective sense, right? It doesn't have that kind of truth happening. But yeah, anyway, nevertheless, it's this particular relation to a certain end of reason itself. What happens in the sublime is similar but different. Crucially, what happens in the sublime is we hit up against the limits of our abilities to synthesize nature. So, for instance, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of staring up at a starry sky and realizing that you simply cannot count the stars or comprehend the vastness of space, right? That's you attempting to simulate and you running up against internal imaginative simulation limitations, right? That's what Kant calls the mathematical sublime, right? And it's an experience of terror, but an experience of terror that is then pleasurable because reason steps in and reason says, well, wait a minute, you can't imagine this, but you can comprehend, for instance, the idea of infinity. Right? You can comprehend the notion of vastness, even if you cannot present it to yourself. So you get this, oh, I still have a certain kind of power, which is a pleasure. But you get an oscillation between pleasure and pain, or terror and pleasure, which becomes awe. So on the basis of Kant's kind of transcendental psychology, which is all there to establish these domains of philosophy of nature and philosophy of freedom, he then has the resources to show that there are in fact kind of limit cases of judgment, limit cases of these synthetic operations in which slightly different things happen. Anyway, right. The thing I should talk about is the critique of teleological judgment, because that's the other half of the third critique. But I'm not going to. I'm going to leave us to maybe have Ben chime in and us have a bit more of a talk. So I'll leave Kant there. I hope that has at least introduced a good chunk of important concepts that are going on in Kant that will recur when we talk about other figures into German idealism. Okay. Hello?
We're here. Do you want to go? Do you ask any more questions? We're a little bit over time.
Yeah.
We can go through with questions.
I'm way over. I'm sorry. It's yeah.
I mean, I want to give the group of people who are in here the ability to ask.
Let's go with some questions, but then maybe we can form some other kind of points of discussion around it.
So any one of you?
Yeah, Pete. I had a question just going back to what your discussion of logical structures, that the doctrine of terms, the doctrine of judgment, the doctrine of inference, and how that was captured by Kant to structure his work and his position. I wanted to make sure if I got that right, that in other words it was an intentional isomorphism that he was trying to go back to and then structure his work around.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, okay. One of the points the reason I wanted to say this is because we are not taught Aristotelian logic like everybody at the time would have been. We don't get what would have been obvious to someone reading the Critique at Kant's time. Like the isomorphism with these logical notions is very opaque if you're not told about it.
And then following up on that, I would like to know, if you don't mind, a bit more clarification in terms of the history of the terms metaphysics in contrast with ontology.
Okay.
That you brought up, that ontology seemed to be captured in the general metaphysics at a certain point, and then becomes distinct from it.
On the term is metaphysica generalis, right? So you get this split between metaphysica generalis and metaphysica specialis, right? It's in, I think, Baumgarten's Metaphysics, right? Which was a text that Kant relied on heavily. That the word ontology got introduced as a synonym for metaphysica generalis, right? So Kant was quite explicitly saying, or at least thinking, what I'm doing when I'm talking about the categories is ontology, in the sense of metaphysica generalis. The problem is that he means, like, I'm describing objects qua objects, right? Which is to say the things synthesized in experience, whereas things in themselves, right, are not necessarily subject to, well, this is an additional issue in Kant, right? There's a question as to how much we can think about things in themselves as opposed to objects, right? Noumena as opposed to phenomena. And Kant says that we can think things in themselves in accordance with the categories. So there's a certain sense in which the ontology that's being done does apply to noumena, right? And specifically to free agents. So, like, the point at which substance kind of comes back into Kant is when he goes, well, like, we can't experience ourselves as subjects, but we know that there's this noumenal freedom that we roughly correspond to, and we can think that through the categories. It's just we can never experience it, and so we can't really know anything about it other than there's this noumenal causation, right? So there is a certain sense in which the ontology does apply to that. It just doesn't apply through what I call the transcendental schematism. So Kant thinks that the categories are, like, woven into the structure of experience, so that, like, the category of causality, for instance, is woven into the very structure of succession in time, right? And that's the idea of temporal succession. Just can't apply that to things in themselves. So, like, the term ontology can be used in relation to Kant, but you've got to be careful, precisely because some people will want to use ontology to talk about, like, the reality of things, and other people still will want to just talk about it in terms of our conceptual scheme of how things appear to us. The latter is kind of closer to what Kant's saying, but there's complexities here. That okay? Okay. Other questions, guys?
So maybe no. Maybe people need to process for a bit.
Yeah. But would you like to say anything about shit that I've missed out, or shit that I've garbled?
No, I mean, one thing I'm interested in would be how certain of the like teleological claims, which I know you didn't get to talk about, and how Kant, you can say, whether he infers or insists on the teleological structure.
Well, I could talk a bit about, or we could talk a bit about teleology if you want.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I think to relate to the general function of aesthetics in Kant, which I think can say a lot and leads a lot to some of the ways that the critique of judgment has been interpreted, especially in the last, especially in the 21st century, is, for a lot of people, or for, some theorists kind of claimed that, some of the use of teleology and the function of teleology in Kant, you could argue that it serves a similar function as the way that beauty does, right? In terms of that, in certain cases, Kant could be said to use teleological judgment as this kind of safety valve, or this kind of like panic button, especially when it relates to certain sciences. Like even the way in which some of his concerns about biology in particular, but also chemistry, which he's very unsure about even up until his death. That that there's this argument has been made that this aesthetics is it's this interesting mix of like the sort of pleasurability of thinking things, but it's also, of course, in the sublime, it's mixed with the pleasurability of thinking things that might otherwise destroy us or upset us, and are the way we think in certain ways. And so I'm just curious, like, how you see, there's this weird mesh there between teleological judgment as, helping us understand, and sort of aesthetics as making things pleasurable to understand, and then there's when you get to things like biology, even like how biology appears in the Architectonic, for instance, in the first critique, biology is this like weirdly upsetting thing, and so I'm just
Well, you're right insofar as it's all about this, like, so basically one way of looking at what Kant's left with at the end of the first critique is, so I mentioned I skipped over the transcendental deduction. The transcendental deduction is supposed to establish what I call the finity, this idea that basically the totality of possible appearances, right, that can come into our systems for simulation and synthesis, right, will play nicely, right. The problem is that that notion of play nicely is quite minimal, right. What he's left with it, so in particular, he's concerned in responding to Hume, right? So Hume famously is like, look, like, causal reasoning is fundamentally illegitimate. It's just about custom, right? Whereas Kant wants to say, no, right? It's legitimate to apply the concept of cause to experience because it's actually been built into the structure of experience in the first place, right? So, right, nature as this totality of possible experiences has to be law-like in some way. The problem that he runs up against is that, again, this law-likeness is incredibly minimal, right? Nature could be fucking crazy. It could have laws that are so complicated and bizarre that we would never ever be able to synthesize stable objects out of them. We would never be able to cut up a nice, neat system of concepts to understand and act in the world. And that weakness of his notion of law-likeness is compensated for both in aesthetics and in the teleological judgment. So it's interesting to use Kant's definition of purposiveness. Kant defines purposiveness as a lawfulness of the contingent as such. So it's like, well, there are these things that are technically contingent, right? Like they technically don't come under laws, but they're kind of law-like, so we can understand them, and that's nice, right? And that's both the case for like formal purposiveness, the technique of nature. Well, it just happens that nature is as if it were constructed by a friendly God who had us in mind, right? And in objective purposiveness and teleology, where we go, okay, so the heart is structured as if it's supposed to be pumping blood around the body, in order to ensure that things are appropriately oxygenated, right? And the crucial gap, really, if you get down to it, it's all about what Kant can't think through his conception of law likeness, which is to say, he thinks laws have to be absolutely necessary. Right? They have to be completely exceptionless. And that means he can't think statistical causation. Kant cannot think tendency at all. It has to be absolutely every time, or just like might be anywhere. You don't know, right? And crucially, like biology, right, is all about tendency. Right? Biology has no fucking exceptionless laws. Right? So if you look at science as being the study of exceptionless laws, biology is not going to look like a science. And so you're going to need something to fit. And what Kant comes up with is this idea of teleological judgment. So, I mean, I can explain this in a bit more detail, but I don't know if I should let Ben sort of riposte here. Do you want to?
I mean, if other people have stuff to say, I mean, I hope they chime in. Like the one thing I would say that's interesting is, like how this kind of lawfulness, how it kind of interacts with, the sciences in general as Kant sees them, especially in his later life, because even in his last texts and in the Opus Posthumum, when he's trying to say, okay, I need some stronger connection between metaphysics and physics, maybe, and like he has these kind of ether proofs, like this idea that maybe there's some substance or there's some substantial, cause or some substantial medium for the relationship between like inner and outer sense. And, for instance, and some people read this as, oh, Kant is just going full Spinozist, or some people read this as, no, this is where he has to go in order to have a critical, post-critical or critical metaphysics. That he has to say, in order for him to stick to this importance of lawfulness, and in order to have, something like teleological judgment have an impact beyond aesthetics, or to have teleology function in a way that serves the role, instead of having this kind of, like you were saying, sort of appealing to biology and having naturalist or evolutionary reasons for why we can sense things or detect structures. For him to say there's a lawfulness that allows us to see the world this way, there might be a physical, right, in the Newtonian sense, like there might be a physical reason for this. Mm-hmm. But so I find that kind of interesting, that tension there, that he kind of has this aesthetic patch, but then in the last instance, he's like, well, maybe that's not enough.
Yeah,
of course,
I think that's probably right. Probably right. Just to kind of add in very briefly for those who are completely confused, I will say something about teleological judgment. Basically, it's just functional explanation. So it's to say, like, like the heart, the purpose of the heart is to pump blood around the body so that cells get oxygen, right? For instance, right? What saying something like that is, what making that kind of judgment enables you to do, is to think about how things that might happen to the heart can systematically, cause it to systematically malfunction, right? So you can think about how if one of the aortal valves gets clogged, right, then the functioning of the heart is going to fail. And that means that any higher level system, like the circulatory system or just the organism as a whole, that depends upon the proper functioning of that part, works, that's going to fail too. So failure kind of cascades through a functional system from the parts to the wholes. And that kind of cascade does delineate like the possibility space for that organism. It gives you a way of like organizing your ways of thinking about how that organism is going to continue to continue to operate within space and time. So like, it gives you a way to sort of schematize it in a way which is nevertheless not like the lawfulness of a kind of proper concept. And that's what you get in teleological judgment, is this sort of like, well, in the absence of concepts that contain necessary laws, right, what you're going to get is this kind of analogy with practical reason, where it's like, it's as if the purpose of the thing is, right, because fundamentally the notion of purposes and means and ends and like systems of means and ends is a part of practical reason, right? Anyway, that's my little thing about teleological judgment. So that might help make sense of what we've been talking about. I hope. Does anybody else have any questions, or just things they'd like to say about Kant, or anything that they think might be relevant, or what I've been saying? Oh, apparently I've been echoing. So
No, it fixed it once I muted you the first time. So
right. Also, just say what you thought of the reading. It doesn't have to necessarily respond to me.
I can't remember if it was Ben or Pete who said this, but in the beginning we were talking about the parts from Kant that you felt were useful. What were the parts that you felt like you were talking about how the German idealists, and maybe specifically Kant, can help us with creative systems of thought, which is the idea of the course. But what are the things that you think that we should be wary of when we're reading these texts from a continental postmodern perspective?
Do you want to go first, Ben? Or
No, you can go. Yeah, I'll think for a second.
okay, well, so I tried to kind of unpack a bit of what Ben was saying about this relationship between subject and substance in what I was saying, but it's worth to go over that again and give some direct references to. So what I was kind of trying to say is that what's interesting about Kant is he like desubstantializes the subject. It just becomes this kind of unity of responsibility, which is sort of related to the activity of synthesis required to make a judgment, right? The thing is that Kant then sort of, well, in my opinion, fucks this up. And the way he fucks it up is through the noumenal, precisely in the idea of the noumenal self. So his idea is, well, okay, so you don't have any relation to yourself as like, a thing in itself, but you can think yourself as a thing in itself, right? And you have to think yourself as a thing in itself, as free in the sense of having like a completely independent causal chain. So what that means is like everything in the world of experience is completely determined, right? Everything is completely determined by whatever happens before it, right? Pure determinism, right? But noumenal selves, noumenal subjects, they can just start their own causal chains as they like. They have like they're not determined by things that come before them. They're just like fucking free to do whatever they want. And there's reasons why Kant wants to make this kind of claim, and some of them are a bit defensible. Some of them can be like finessed in order to make this slightly less awful, right? But if you take someone like Zizek, right, Zizek will just fucking embrace this and be like, yeah, noumenal freedom, fucking woo! Like, that's, a bad Zizek impression maybe, but basically he will maintain that, well, essentially what's essential about the subject is the fact that it's this sort of break in reality, right, in which, which disrupts sort of any conception of a causal order. And this will get related to Badiou as well, and Adrian Johnston will put a neuro philosophical gloss on it, but I think it's going back on what the really good bits of Kant are and overemphasizing the bad bits. I don't know if Ben wants to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, one way to do it, I think, in terms of relating it to contemporary philosophy or thinking about some of the developments in postmodernism or, more recent things, is partially to look at, the legacy of German idealism, in terms of how, how, not only how deeply influential it was, but sort of how some of the problems which, some of the problems which people claimed philosophy had gotten away from continue to haunt continental philosophy. And I mean, it's very easy to see in certain contexts. Like, one of the most striking examples for me is, people often claim that, like, Deleuze and Hegel, for instance, are just like totally opposed and have nothing to do with each other. Something Deleuzians, you talk about Hegel in a room of Deleuzians, the joke is like they start foaming at the mouth and like people get really angry. But if you, one of Deleuze's huge influences was Hippolyte, and Hippolyte, was one of the two main strands of French Hegelianism, but the one that's discussed less. The one that people talk about more is, of course, the Kojève, Lacan, that kind of stream, which goes to Badiou and to Zizek, whereas the kind of, the Hippolyte stream very much goes to Foucault and Deleuze. You look at Deleuze's review of Hippolyte's book, this Structure and Genesis book, this really famous book on Hegel. The sentence of this review, which is written in '54, Deleuze says, couldn't we have an articulation of expression and difference that didn't rely purely on negativity, right? And of course, Deleuze's answer to that question is yes, and I'm going to write difference repetition as the yes to that question. So, the idea that the kind of structural problems and the kind of general scheme of German idealism, infects philosophy far after it, and sort of Kantian problems also don't go away. So I think, but I think, the thing to keep in mind is the fact that because German idealism was trying to do a critically inflected systematic philosophy, I think what's important to keep in mind is that strands of philosophy which want to have the depth of philosophy but not the breadth of philosophy that the German idealists attempted, I think it's important to keep in mind, like, you know, there's no is there a reason for philosophy not to be the kind of broad program that the German idealists had? And if there's something, if German idealism, kind of haunts contemporary philosophy, is it because it wasn't, it shouldn't be seen that because it was this like attempt to put a system on everything. Instead of anything, and I think Pete was kind of suggesting this with Kant, it's that, were they generic enough? Like the idea is that like the kind of structural ambit and the idea of like how can we talk about thought in general? These kinds of projects, which can be interpreted as can be seen as a universalism. Not that it's trying to like stamp everything and make everything fit into it, but it's very much is that given how complex the world is, and the German idealists were good at recognizing in the sciences and history and theology and myth and everything, given Kant's limitations, but given how complex the world is, how do we make things hold together in a way that we can all have competing systems, in a way that makes more sense of the world? So it's this very broad, ambitious claim, but it's not. I don't think it's this closed one that's often taken to be. And so I think a lot of the postmodern critiques of it can say relevant things that they were people of their time, and that gives them certain limitations. But that the structural aspect of the project, in being this kind of open systematicity, I think is something that's never gone away, even if people claim that they're doing something else. If that makes sense.
I mean, one like thing I could add to that. Ooh, I'll let maybe Ben respond to that question.
I mean, it depends on who. I mean, this would probably differ between the German idealists in a way. I mean, we'll probably get to this. The idea that, I think for all of them see very much, want to historicize or, make complex the very idea of system. Hegel is the one that's often seen to be like he's saying there is one system, like my system, does this. This is it. He basically, in 1806, saying philosophy is over now. But the degree to which that can be read as closed is questionable, given the way in which Hegel sees history. This is something that people fight about. The idea that Hegel says he has a closed system, but if it's or finished system, but if it's appropriately generic. You could argue that, well, if it articulates this kind of retroactive function to history, that history is constantly seeing itself as possibly at an end, you can argue that it's a kind of generic structure that allows for warring interpretations based on its kind of scaffolding. So on the one hand, and this is very much this is because arguably Hegel socializes reason in a way. That's very fundamental to his project. So you could say there's a parallelism in terms of the collective work of philosophy, but at one step back, it might be a more closed system than other people might want to allow. Whereas someone like Schelling will say that there are always multiple systems of philosophy because the person, the creators of them are limited. This doesn't mean that you should never make a system, it's just that systems are going to fall apart and be replaced. So it's always this tension, which sounds like Hegel in some ways, but the emphasis on who's doing the work and where the limitations lie is different. And the physics is even more complicated, but I'll save that for next week or for next time. But yeah, Pete, if you want to say something.
I'll just leave it on Hegel because I'll be teaching Hegel, and I will be presenting a kind of closed Hegel. But in like what I'd like to think of as an end of history Hegel, like there is definitely a certain kind of end of history thesis in Hegel, right? I think you have to face up to it, but I think generally what should be faced up is just how ambitious it was and how how impressively articulated it is, rather than just dismissing it out of hand. But crucially, like, and I think this is where it like ties into what Ben's been saying, is that nevertheless, what was so interesting about Hegel's way of going about things was that, and this is the case for I think all of these things, insofar as they begin by thinking about thought itself, right? Is they're very much concerned with revision, revisability, like the way in which our systems of thought and our theories change, right? So they're, like, to a man, essentially concerned to give an account of the structure of that revision so that they can sort of point out how it is going to continue in the future. But to some extent, they want to give a not necessarily a final, but certainly a fixed account of what that revision involves, and how determined that fixed account is going to differ. So, like Hegel, will think, right, in the logic I have given you like the complete set of logical concepts through which to understand the way in which we will continue talking about non-logical things for eternity or whatever, right? And Kant is going to say something similar about, like, in the critique I have given sort of like an account of how, like, say, arguments and debates within science and the revision of scientific concepts are just going to continue, right? Or debates in politics and ethics are going to kind of go on, but however, that being said, they're fundamentally concerned with justifying these accounts and with disagreeing with one another. They are going to claim that they are right about this account of the structure of thought and the limitations of the continued process of rational revision and development of human thinking, right? And I think that the way they go about it is fundamentally virtuous. So if I could contrast this to, like, another kind of contemporary strand of thought that I don't understand hugely well, I understand it well enough to say what I'm going to say, which is kind of Laruel's non-philosophy. So in Laruel's non-philosophy, what you get, by contrast, is this sort of, like, yes, it's a pluralism, but it's an enforced pluralism, which it's axiomatically enforced by the claim that fundamentally any philosophical system is false. Right? Every philosophical system is inadequate to the one, right? And this means that fundamentally you can't even see them as really disagreeing. Right? They're just different things to be used for different things. Right? Different ideas to be used in different ways. But there's no real contest. Right? Whereas with the German idealists, like, they're a contest. There is a disagreement between Hegel and Schelling, and it's an interesting and important one that you can work through and learn things from and get things out of. The other side of this is that, like, in order to make this kind of claim or to set up this non-philosophical edifice, Laruel has to present an account of thought, right? He has to give you an account of this duality, or what is it called? I'm forgetting the precise name, but this system of thinking whereby philosophy makes itself sufficient, right? But fundamentally, you can't argue with Laruelians about the account of thought that's based on, right? There's just, like, here's a kind of description of thought, and on that basis we can make this axiomatic kind of intervention. But there's no way of going, well, wait a minute, the presuppositions on which this axiomatic intervention is based are fundamentally a bit dodgy. Like, maybe the logic you're using is slightly wrong. That's a kind of critical disagreement that the German idealists could and did have with one another. Like, if you want to look at the difference between Hegel and Fichte, for instance, there'll be big logical disagreements, right, about the basic structure of what thinking is. Right? But, you know, what you get with something like Orwell, and I suspect with a lot of other sort of, and I don't want to say the postmodernists, but with a lot of other sort of postmodern inflected forms of thinking, will be attempts to make large-scale claims about thought that then disavow themselves. Then are like, oh well, but I'm not really presenting a kind of theory that has to stand up to critical scrutiny. It'll just be like, oh, it's just a device. It's just this practice I need to do, and that I find disingenuous, and that's where I think German idealism is really worthwhile, because it's like, no, this is how thought works, and I might be wrong, but right, we're going to actually have to disagree and work on it.
Okay, I think we're getting over to about being an hour over the 2.5 hour set class, so I think we should wrap soon. Oh no, 12 to 12:30. Sorry.
Yeah, not.
Sorry, I'm mixing up the timing. I'm sorry. We're still on time. I apologize.
What so does anybody else want to bring in anything? So again, like, bring in anything from any other bit of philosophy you want to kind of bring in and discuss and compare.
Yeah, I have two questions. I guess I'll go with systematicity first and ask kind of the parallel question to Matthew's, or more just like asking for context. Where, I guess, if you could talk about the importance of systematicity or the legacy of German idealism with regard to Anglo-American analytic philosophy. I'm thinking more of Brandom and sort of that kind of introduction to Hegel I got, where there's like a very pragmatic version of Hegel as sort of the first philosopher who, I guess the way I understand it, kind of like gives you like the first kind of closes kind of like the feedback loop of normativity, rational normativity. Like, but I guess he's like pretty anti-systematic. I don't know if you could talk about that context a bit. I know it's something you do. So.
Well, yeah, guilty as charged. I am Brandon. Me and I bleed explicitness. But one thing I'd say basically is I got taught Hegel by Stephen Houlgate, who at Warwick, and he's an absolutely fantastic Hegelian who believes Hegel is right about everything and can argue it really hard. And he is very clear that Hegel is a metaphysician, right? And if you don't appreciate that, you're getting Hegel wrong. And I agree with him. So I think Brandom's Hegel, as much as I think there's great bits of it, he just misses out the metaphysical bits of Hegel, which is wrong. But at the same time, right, I think he's right about a lot of the non-metaphysical bit. So crucially, like this reading I gave of Kant is like desubstantivizing the subject. That's Brandom. That's Brandom's reading of Kant, and he basically reads Hegel as carrying that on further, precisely because Hegel presents a social account of it. Presents a social account of how we gain this normative status of being a subject that can bind ourselves to norms governing the use of language. So seeing concepts as social norms rather than like personal principles, is the word Kant. I think that what's fantastic about Brandom's work is it even if it's not quite right as a reading of Kant and Hegel, it gets the good bit of Kant and Hegel. It gets this desubstantialization of the subject, or this thinking about the nature of normativity and thought as something which is essentially normative, right, and completely drains it of all metaphysics. And what's interesting about that is So I mean, two things I should say is, one, Random is very systematic for an analytic philosopher. Like making it explicit is someone trying to do philosophy of language like they're in 19th century Germany, right? That being said, he often disavows his own systematic impulses. And particularly, he disavows like foundational claims, and that's where he's insufficiently Kantian and Hegelian, from my view. So weirdly, like I've been talking about transcendental psychology and functionalism, right?
That was my other question. So
Random has this, Between Saying and Doing, which is a fucking phenomenal little book. It's absolutely amazing, and we'll still be appreciating its insights for decades to come, in my view, right? Because it lays out this really interesting approach to artificial intelligence, right? But he should come out and say what it is, which is transcendental psychology. Like, Bob, you're doing fucking transcendental psychology, own up to it, right? But he always wants to kind of present himself as being more kind of tentative and like Lewisian, like David Lewis, than he actually is in terms of the subject matter he's engaging with. That's one side of that. The other thing I would say about it is he's also completely anti-metaphysical. Like, that's why he's very reluctant to read metaphysics in Hegel. He's very anti-metaphysical. And I think too anti-metaphysical. My take on this is that once you have pursued this Kantian line properly, like this, like, look, we're just thinking about subjectivity and thought in a completely non-metaphysical way, right? Once you've pursued that, then you're free to actually do metaphysics. You're free to do it in a non-circular way, because you can say what metaphysics is, right, without having to use metaphysical premises, right? And another way of saying that is to say you can do the critique of metaphysics. You can actually come back to Kant and do what Kant was trying to do, which is just to limit what metaphysics is, and then get on your merry way. So my readings of a lot of the problems in German idealism is actually that it still jumps the gun metaphysically. It aims too quickly to get metaphysics out of its account of thought, whereas actually something like what Kant himself was doing is more appropriate, and that actually a lot of the resources of the analytic appropriation of Kant and Hegel can be used to do that. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I guess like my other question was about this idea of transcendental psychology, and if you could like talk a bit further about it. Let's see, in my very cursory reading of this, the quote that stuck out is where Kant is saying that there's no practical psychology as a special philosophy of human nature. This bit, I don't know, that with relation to transcendental psychology, and I guess what empirical psychology or causal psychology, I don't know, like what his philosophy of mind, how those terms interact in Kant's philosophy of mind.
Well, I think what's good in Kant is he keeps them completely separate. Mm-hmm. Like, he's really, like, one of the things I hate about a lot of early analytic readings of Kant, so like Strawson, for instance, is he basically just dismisses Kant's transcendental psychology completely as, basically, this is bad empirical psychology. And I feel the same way about Husserlian phenomenologists who are all like, oh, this is just phenomenology. It's like, it's not really, at heart, it's not meant to be introspective psychology or empirical psychology, right? The question is, did Kant himself articulate an appropriate relationship between empirical psychology and transcendental psychology? And that's where I think I don't think he did. I haven't done enough reading to really circumscribe it as precisely as I would like. Because we know that empirical psychology and that elements of it become important to him through, for instance, the anthropology, right? The really embarrassing anthropology, right?
Mhm.
What I think prevents him from ever establishing the connection between the two correctly is precisely the stuff on noumenal freedom. Because at the end of the day, you can never give a description of a rational agent as a causal system, which completely captures what it is. You always have to proceed to appeal to some causality beyond it, and that's where Kant is messing up his own brilliance.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I take that quote to mean, like that practical psychology is an absurdity, just as practical physics is an absurdity. Yeah, that's how I understand that quote, kind of.
yeah, but then there are times
With
when
it.
later on he wants to kind of say things like, actually, well, yeah, there sort of is. Like, there are things we can say about human nature, and they're going to be kind of important to, like, say, practical philosophy or something like this.
Mhm.
And that's when he's like, you're running up against your own self-imposed limitations.
Mhm.
Um,
Really, that's great. Thanks.
Phil looked like he was about to ask a question there, so I'm gonna. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to. You talked at the beginning about the way that there's this Copernican myth about Kant and a sharp demarcation between noumena and phenomena, and a radical split there. I thought the text that we had to read was pretty interesting because of the way it well, it seemed to sort of break down some of that for me, at least in part. And I think about the idea of systematicity, because obviously part of that text is all about the system of, system sort of in the sense of architectonics and his system of thought as a whole. But also there's sort of, perhaps what Ben was talking about, interesting moments where there seems to be quite a Spinozist idea of a sort of systematicity of nature itself that comes up at various points. And then particularly this strange relationship between the way in which somebody talks about a compatibility or a suitability or a harmony or an accord between certain between basically our power of judgment on the one hand and the way the world is structured on the other hand. So basically, that nature could be really chaotic and random. We could have millions of empirical laws that we can never get the hang of, but somehow, neatly for us, there's a sort of a natural hierarchy of these rules that one leads to another. And there's certain bits where he really does sound sort of like kind of proto-Hegelian or sort of Spinozist or something like that, where he talks about nature specifying its general laws into empirical ones in accordance with the form of a logical system on behalf of the power of judgment. That's sort of halfway down page 19. And it seems to be slightly different emphasis, but I couldn't really see this kind of bit of it where it's almost like some sort of, I don't really know, but the sort of the way our mind works and the way the nature works seems to sort of be suited to each other or fit together neatly. And it seems sort of different from looking at the diagram that you've drawn, which is probably more based on the system in the first critique. It seems to be a different idea of the way in which kind of reason and the world meet, or nature, subject and object meet. And I don't know if it is different or if how it fits into that. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Again, this is my fault for trying to cram the entirety of the first critique into however long I was speaking at the beginning. and not leaving enough space to talk about the third. So the crucial part of the diagram is the bit on reason. So if I can bring this back up again. So here I describe reason, and I say, like, one of the rules of reason is systematicity. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the contrast between the unity of the understanding and the unity of reason. This idea that the subject isn't just making individual judgments, the subject is making a whole bunch of judgments, and they have to be made into a kind of consistent picture of the world, right? So the heart of Kant's conception of systematicity is his account of the faculty of reason. This idea that, well, what we need are this set of judgments that are consistent, that are comprehensive, which means that if there are any further consequences of the judgments you've made, you draw out those consequences and make sure that they're consistent, right? And then this third idea of economy, which is having as few principles as you need. So, for instance, not multiplying distinctions beyond their usefulness, having a neat hierarchy of concepts like genus and species in biology, or elements in physics, or whatever, right? So crucially, what's interesting is Kant's notion of systematicity starts out as an epistemological notion, right? It's about how reason organizes itself, right? What's interesting about the third critique is that this notion of systematicity then bleeds out elsewhere. So, firstly, in this notion of the technique of nature, what he realizes is, oh crap, there's no guarantee that nature is such that we can actually produce the systematicity. So we have to not just hold ourselves to the systematicity, we have to assume that the systematicity is already there in nature itself. We treat nature as if it is itself purposive for our understanding, right? And what I said earlier is this is kind of a compensation for a problem of the first critique that he didn't quite solve there. This possibility of chaotic or just over complex laws, right? The second place it bleeds through is in teleology, whereby basically, in order to say understand an organism, the idea is, oh, we're going to have to understand it as if it was a systematic set of means and ends, right? So we treat it as if it's been designed, right, in a way, in accordance with a set of purposes that are themselves consistent, comprehensive, and economical, right? So the systematicity of reason gets used in this analogy to understand organic life. Now, what's interesting about how this feeds into later German idealism is that this transformation of systematicity as an epistemological notion into this kind of organic notion, this notion of organism, right, will kind of reflux, so that with like Schelling and Hegel and people who come after them, there will be this thinking of reason as an organic thing, or thinking of and actually, I mean, with Hegel, definitely thinking of, well, it's not just as if reality was created in this systematic way. It is created in this systematic way, right? Reality fundamentally is the idea of reason specifying itself into these neat, consistent comprehensive and economical like categories. So I mean, you're totally right to pick me up on this, because it is what's kind of crucial. But what's interesting is that it starts out purely epistemologically. It's in Kant, it's just this notion of reason as this series of operations we've got to perform to have a proper conception of the world. And those epistemological notions get transformed and reflux on themselves in weird ways. Does that help? Interestingly, just as a quick point, Brandom, I think, has the best sort of account of how this systematicity works in Kant in this book, Reason in Philosophy. Oh, sorry. I'm still sharing. So in this book, Reason in Philosophy, Brandom gives a really kind of stripped down interpretation of Kant and Hegel, which is massively stripped down. But his account of the transcendental unity of apperception in here is an excellent account of what Kant calls the unity of reason. Brandom is terrible when it comes to all the stuff that goes on beneath the level of judgment, but at the level of judgment and reason, he's great. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to bring up? I could say something briefly about the Jew if anyone was interested, but I don't know if anybody is. So, okay, what's interesting about? Oh, yeah, okay, we've got biters. What's interesting about the Jew's project, right, is this split between being an event and the logic of worlds. So the theory of being, which really, I mean, he thinks mathematics is ontology. Being an event is meta-ontology. It's interpreting the significance of mathematics, but really, it's this account of being, right? And then on the other hand, the account of appearing in the logic of worlds, which is a phenomenology, but in the sense of like a logic of appearance. What's fascinating is the more I read about Badiou, the more I realize just how close to Kant he is, actually. Like the distinction between like inconsistent multiplicities, right? What's talked about in being an event, right? And as you know, the multiple without unity, right? And objects which have unity. So being in itself has no unity. It's only in appearing that we get objects that are unities, right? Units. But this is very much paralleling the Kant distinction between things in themselves and objects. And Badiou's fairly explicit about this, right? Insofar as what you have in the account of appearing is his account of transcendentals, the structures of a world, right, within which objects can appear that you can then think about, right? But crucially, the logic he's using is not Aristotelian logic. It's much more modern logic, based on category theory. And there are several things that are interesting about this. One is, so for Kant, there is just a single domain of object. There's just the world of experience, right? That's the empirical domain that the natural sciences can study, right? And it's just a single deterministic world of objects constituting other objects, and it's perfect for the study of natural science. Badiou doesn't think there can be a single world. He thinks there are just these particular situations that emerge. with their own kind of consistency within which objects can turn up as unities. So that's one interesting thing. The other interesting thing is that so Kant, as I said earlier, thinks that we can think things in themselves, even if we can't know them. We can't have experience, we can't have knowledge, right? But we can think them through the categories, and this means that we can know something very, very minimal about them, right? Which is A, that they exist, and B, that they are consistent, that they obey the law of non-contradiction, right? This is what Meillassoux calls Kant's weak correlationism, right? The idea is, well, we can really only know things as they appear to us, but we can know this minimal thing about things in themselves. What's interesting about Badiou is it's as if he found a more substantive thing to say than things in themselves exist and they're consistent. In decreeing axiomatically that what is prior to appearance has no unity, right? It's just multiplicity in itself, and then saying that set theory describes axiomatically the structure of pure multiplicity, right? He enables himself to use more than just the principle of non-contradiction to talk about things in themselves. He can use the whole edifice of set theory and then use this kind of meta-ontological interpretation to circumscribe the relation between being and appearance. And then the way in which this is circumscribed ends up producing something like the noumenal freedom you get in Kant, insofar as the event starts looking a lot like the kind of regulative way we have to think about our noumenal causal freedom in Kant. So it's very, very Kantian, and in fact works out a lot of the ideas of Kant in sort of certainly more modern logical ways in terms of the way in which he thinks about the synthesis of objects. Right. I hope that was somewhat interesting. Okay. Ben, do you have anything you would like to close with? Or is there anything else anyone wants to bring up? No. Okay, can I ask one thing then? Would there be anyone willing to do a presentation next week? Doesn't have to be long.
2 weeks, right?
Oh yeah, sorry. I forget there's a break.
Yes, in 2 weeks.
Yeah, you'll do it in 2 weeks. Great. That's so we've got one signed up. If anyone would like to sign up to do a presentation on Hegel or Schelling as well, that'd be much appreciated. The other thing is, we thoroughly encourage you to post to the Google Classroom now you're signed up. If you've got things you want to put in, both me and Ben will be there and potentially posting things ourselves. So if we could have sort of any conversations about issues to do with systematicity or the idea of describing thought or any of this stuff really, you know, this is just kind of, I mean, I'm just really happy to be talking about German idealism. It's nice. It makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. So the more I get to do it, the better. But if there's nothing else anyone wants to raise, I think we're done. Okay. Great, guys.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Can I ask why in 2 weeks?
Otherwise, it'd fall on Thanksgiving, and it.
So the next seminar is postponed, right?
Yeah. So it basically, it doesn't matter to me because I don't celebrate Thanksgiving, but for everyone in the States, it's a big thing. So
Okay. Me too. I'm in Greece. I mean, yeah. I could sign up for a small presentation, although I have to say that I found it really difficult to navigate through these texts. They seem, especially this one, it's one of the most difficult that I've read. But I could prepare something for the next.
Sorry for throwing you at the deep end. I mean, the other thing is that, for instance, if you wanted to do something on Hegel, I've set very difficult texts from Hegel, but they're the foundational ones that I wanna do the kind of, bricks and mortar foundation stuff. But for instance, if you were like, I want to talk about this particular bit of Hegel, which is much later on and is much more specific and I find much easier to digest, I'd be totally happy for that.
Great. I think specificity would help me in this kind of occasion. But we could talk about it in the classroom page.
Yeah, great. We'll talk about
set
it there.
it this week, more or less. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
No problem.
Have a great night, evening, day, I don't know.
Me too.
Right. How'd that go?
I think it seemed to go well. I think.
Fuck. I did the usual thing of talking for way too long, because I tried to squeeze everything in and can't.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot, of course.
I apologize for that, and please do call me on it. I just, I also realized that I transcribed my notes wrong, and so there was a particular bridge between 2 points that I had just missed, and I got through and was like, oh, for fuck's sake. So.
Yeah, well, even for the intro, I didn't really know what to do because I didn't want to talk about conceptual stuff too much, but I didn't want to just do history, so I didn't even know if that was coherent or not. But.
No, the intro was great, and it was really, really kind of straightforward and digestible. I worry that I just give a whole bunch of indigestible stuff, but at least it's all of the conceptual stuff you may need to deal with some of this. So, but yeah, we'll see. It'll work out hopefully.
Yeah, I think so. People ask questions, which is good. So.
Yeah. It'll get easier, and I'm gonna try and ruthlessly cut down my Hegel. Yeah. Right, guys. Thanks for this. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks, Pete, for doing the first one.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to your Fichte. I get to just sort of read Fichte and oh. Yeah.
He's so weird, but yeah. It'll be.
Carry on. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say yeah. I mean, it's just funny because I was forced to learn him because I had to sort of for my dissertation I had to go through him, which was more enjoyable than I expected. But yeah, he's just a total maniac. And I don't know how much of him you've read, but
very little. I mean, it's one of those things where I know I really should read him because there are certain bits that are really important for my own work.
Mm-hmm.
But those particular bits of work that are really important for, I never get the excuse to do. So I'm never forced to read Fichte, and I also never know where to start. So, but the stuff about the primacy of practical reason really is. I think that's going to be an interesting dimension to talk about, given what's come up in discussion and my obvious normative leanings.
Yeah, I mean, I think And more and more I think about it, like part of the reason why German idealism is so weird, but I think why it's interesting is because it's idealistic, but it's idealistic at a time when the kind of bottom fell out of the world in terms of like politically, mathematically,
Yeah.
scientifically, like everything. So on the one hand, they kind of had to really think about how do we build and how do we like create all these things when there's no like the solid ground we don't have in so many ways. So it actually makes them weirdly very pragmatic on the one hand, but also speculative, right? I mean, it's kind of the
Yeah.
whole gist, which is I think why it's so interesting.
Well, it's that combination of rigor and ambition that's just
Yeah.
delightful.
Yeah.
Because one without the other is either dry or bizarre. Yeah. Well, cool. And so not next week, but the week after.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yep.
Are you still there, Tony?
He's a ghost.
Right. I wanted to say goodbye to him and thanks properly, but I'll just leave. I need to go and say hello to my girlfriend who's hiding upstairs. Right. Catch you.
Yeah. See ya.